At first glance, it looks like a single story, as if from the end of the 19th century through to the era of space shuttles, someone had been observing Earth from orbit, and successive generations were merely uncovering fragments of the same mystery. The problem is that when one looks closely at the sources, this apparent continuity begins to break down. Instead of a single narrative, a collection of threads emerges, which were only connected to one another years later. The modern Black Knight satellite theory did not come into being as a coherent narrative. It arose as a composition of several independent stories from different decades, which over time were stitched together into a single myth about a mysterious object in orbit. It was not the continuity of events, but their later combination, that became the foundation of this story. It is precisely this aspect, compositionality instead of chronological logic, that popular science analyses and fact-checking materials draw attention to. The most frequently cited beginning of this legend is the era of early radio technology and the figure of Nikola Tesla. Circulating accounts suggest that in 1899 Tesla allegedly received intelligent, repetitive signals, later interpreted as the first contact or the first trace of an object observing Earth. At the level of primary sources, however, the situation appears more complex. Tesla did in fact conduct radio experiments in Colorado Springs in 1899 and declared that he had received unusual signals. His statements were widely commented on in the press at the turn of the century, and were often presented as possible communication with Mars. This media amplification of the idea of signals from Mars is confirmed by archival materials, documenting the press reception of his words. The linking of these signals to a specific satellite in orbit, however, is a much later interpretation, not directly derived from contemporary documents. The cultural context was conducive to such interpretations. As early as 1896, an article titled "A Signal from Mars" appeared in the press, describing a luminous projection on the southern edge of the planet as a possible signal sent by its inhabitants. The same motif returned a few years later in music. The 1901 piece, "A Signal from Mars, March and Two-Step," presented a vision of Martians communicating with Earth using a spotlight, while another observed our planet through a telescope. Radio, only just emerging as a technology, quickly became, in the public imagination, a tool for contact with other worlds. In this climate, Tesla in 1901 put forward the sensational claim that he was receiving radio signals from Mars. The story was widely taken up by the press. Tesla mentioned unusual signals in correspondence with the reporter Julian Hawthorne, as well as in a letter concerning potential discoveries of the new century, in which he wrote about messages from another world, with the sequence 1, 2, 3. Journalists treated this as evidence of communication with Mars. Tesla himself, however, noted in the article Talking with Planets that it was not initially obvious to him whether the signals were intelligently controlled, and he allowed for various possible sources, from Mars to other planets. Later, hypotheses appeared suggesting that Tesla may in fact have intercepted radio experiments conducted in Europe or signals from other pioneers of wireless communication. Although reports of messages from Mars fired the imagination of the media, they did not attract significant interest within the scientific community. As radio developed, similar stories began to multiply. A 1920 article describing Guglielmo Marconi's belief that he had received signals from planets even quoted statements suggesting that inhabitants of other worlds were trying to contact us. Over time, it became clear that these were not signals from Mars, but radio became permanently embedded in the history of the search for life beyond Earth. Educational studies analyzing the context of the era show how easy it was at the end of the 19th century to misattribute the origin of signals to planets given the state of knowledge at the time. The inclusion of Tesla in the Black Knight narrative therefore remains a hypothesis or speculation. It requires a clear leap from an unusual radio signal to a specific object in orbit. Another root of the legend appears already within the realities of the Cold War. At the turn of February and March 1960, the American press reported on a dark or silent object detected in orbit. These reports aroused concern and speculation about a reconnaissance satellite, allegedly of non-human origin, particularly in the context of a polar orbit. In press materials from the period, however, this episode was described as an identification problem. The object was linked to remnants of an American Discoverer program satellite, and the delay in identifying it was presented as the result of imperfect coordination of tracking systems. There are also archival documents discussing contemporary media narratives about a mystery object and showing that uncertainty and interpretive anxiety dominated rather than evidence of extraterrestrial origin. The claim that the object was in orbit before humanity was capable of placing satellites into polar orbit appears only in later versions of the story. In the 1970s, a moment occurs that, for many versions of the legend, becomes the point at which earlier threads are fused together. In 1973, Duncan Lunan published a speculative interpretation of data concerning long-delayed radio echoes, suggesting the possible existence of a probe and attempting to fit delay patterns to an astronomical structure. The text itself had the character of an essay, self-critical, but clearly speculative. What is important for later mythology is that the LDE phenomenon did not for a long time receive a single stable explanation. Reports were sporadic, difficult to reproduce, and even more difficult to verify conclusively. As a result, a whole range of interpretations began to emerge, from models of wave propagation in the ionosphere and magnetosphere to hypotheses assuming that the signal might have circled the Earth multiple times before returning to the receiver. Each of these concepts functioned separately, most often as fragments of survey analyses without a definitive resolution. Lunan described how he initially interpreted the delay sequences as a star map, pointing to Epsilon Boötis, and then withdrew this explanation for scientific reasons. In subsequent considerations, he drew attention to other coincidences, linking radio data with archaeoastronomical orientations of sites such as Stonehenge or the Pyramids of Giza. The author emphasized the controversial nature of his theses and the lack of proof, treating them as circumstantial reasoning on the boundary between science and hypothesis. Over time, Lunan increasingly distanced himself from his original conclusions. He pointed out methodological errors, explained that Epsilon Boötis had served rather as a time marker than a star of origin, and firmly dissociated himself from the Black Knight satellite theory. He also explained that the supposedly mysterious satellites from the late 1950s and early 1960s were in fact elements of American satellite programs, and that photographs from the late 1990s depicted ordinary orbital debris. The most recognizable visual element of the legend appears in 1998 during the STS-88 space shuttle mission. Photographs of a dark, irregular object floating above Earth began to circulate on the internet, described as the Black Knight. In public image databases, there exists a specific frame of this scene, described in the metadata as space debris. The fact-checking version links this object to a thermal blanket lost during a spacewalk. This interpretation is based on mission reports and crew communications, as well as journalistic analyses indicating the coherence of events leading to the blanket's escape. At the same time, it is noted that the lack of full context, changes in internet archives, and the omission of standard journalistic practices contributed to the growth of suspicions about the covering up of traces. In practice, it was precisely the year 1998 and the orbital photographs that became, for the internet, the anchor allowing earlier, scattered threads, from Tesla, through radio echoes and reports from 1960, to Lunan's speculations, to be combined into a single story about the same object observing Earth for decades or even millennia. On the margins of this narrative, there is also another frequently confused element, the existence of a British rocket program called Black Knight from the years 1958 to 1965. The similarity of names is sometimes used in online summaries as an additional reinforcement of the legend, despite referring to an entirely different context. As a result, the Black Knight satellite does not appear as a single story with a clearly defined beginning and continuity of events. It is rather a mosaic of independent episodes, interpretations, and speculations that over time were combined into one narrative, without a single common source. If you have your own interpretation of these facts, leave it in the comments. And if you want to return to stories like this more often, subscribe and stay for the next video.